Hello. Today I'm going to look at different models of political economics. I use the phrase political economics because that was the phrase coined by Adam Smith when he wrote his book. He wasn't the first economist, though he's often considered to be. The first book on economics was written by somebody called Xenophon in ancient Greece, but that was household economics. And the first, or the earliest work I'm aware of to do with actual economics in a broader sense was done by Copernicus, who studied the variation in the price of gold in and out of a port. I should be looking at these models across the field from left to right, from the left wing to the right wing. I should be using the original meanings of left and right wing, which come from the Elysee Palace near Paris in France around the time of the Revolution, when the left wing of the palace had those people who were interested in the rights of the people and supporting the people, and the right wing of the palace had the interests of the aristocracy at heart. So I should be using left wing to indicate support for the poor among society, and right wing to indicate support for the privileged, the rich. I shall start with the furthest left point, which, though it's difficult to put things on a continuum, is probably anarchy, libertarian communism. Anarchy is a removal of all government. Some people argue that it's not necessarily all government, but it's certainly a reduction in state power to a great degree. A removal of all government which allows people then to live and profit freely. It's a very difficult situation to support. It's never really been shown to work in the way people believe, and it's also called libertarian communism because for it to work, then you need a removal of the private property or the ownership of land. Malatesta, who wrote the book, the seminal work, Anarchy, said himself that if you continue to allow ownership of real property, that wasn't anarchy, that was simply theft. So that's libertarian communism right at the left-hand side of our continuum. A complete freedom from the state, a lack of support maybe from the state as well, but thought to be as far left as you can go because it's a complete freedom from control by others. The next one's communism. Communism is often misinterpreted. Communism is when there is a system where everybody works as they're able towards the common good, and then everybody simply shares the common good that's produced. There is no real market. If there's enough food produced, everybody shares the food out. It's a system that hasn't really been put in place in places where they've claimed it has been. It did work on a small scale in some parts of China. It certainly didn't happen across China even during the time of Mao Zedong. Communism requires a lack of ownership in real property again. Not in personal property though, you still will own the clothes on your back and things like that, you still own smaller things, but larger things like factories are jointly owned by the people who work there, but the people who work there don't profit from it so much as they produce those goods and share them with other people who are working in farms maybe, or in other areas in teaching and sharing their own knowledge, experience and the goods evenly amongst people. It has been shown to be very effective in small groups. A group that certainly worked well as a communist group were the earliest settlers in America. It was known that up to the time when they got a couple of thousand in population, they worked a system where people simply shared the goods, where they simply shared the workload and shared the goods. Beyond that number of people, it's very difficult to control. You start needing organizational structures to share the goods and administrators, and those people themselves aren't working towards the goods, and they have more control over the goods, and it becomes more and more difficult and needs more and more oversight. The next one is egalitarianism, or Georgism as it's sometimes called. Egalitarianism is the idea that all of the land, in general, is the property of all the people, and that they should all share in the wealth. It doesn't mean there's an entirely even share, but it does mean that everybody should get enough to live on across a nation from the assets of that nation. It's the basis of things like the universal minimum income economies and similar ideas. They have been shown to work quite well in the test areas they've operated in places like India. What they showed was that people still continue to work in the factories, etc., with the guarantee of the income. I should probably explain what the minimum income scheme is. The minimum income scheme is that everybody, regardless of who they are individually, gets paid enough money to live, have a roof over their head, and to have a little bit of spare money so they can be part of the community. And you'd think that once they all had all that, people would have enough, but people find the need to have an identity, and that identity frequently comes from your place of work and your involvement in the community, in supporting the community. And it has been shown that people will continue to work in such a scheme. They don't need to be paid by an employer quite as much, because there's already money coming from the state to support them. People will be more likely to be entrepreneurs in such a scheme, because they're not worrying about feeding their family with the idea they have for a new product. They're just worrying about covering the costs of setting up and running the business. The next subject on from that is, the next one is socialism. Socialism is the idea that factories themselves continue to have a market between them and trade goods between them. There continues to be that business, but the factories are owned by the people who work in them. This has been shown to be very effective in some Spanish companies that have run for a long time as democratic socialist organisations, where the workers vote who's going to run the plant and organise things, and the workers all generally have high productivity and work well for the shared wealth they get from their successful venture. The next one from that is actually a form of capitalism, but it's not traditional capitalism, it's state capitalism. It's the earliest level when a state is, usually by revolution, moving towards communism. The first thing that's needed is the state needs control of all the assets if they're going to share it out and create socialist workers, cooperatives and factories, and then move towards communism. Usually states don't get past this stage. State capitalism is what they had in Russia. The original power came in from all the rich feudal lords. Administrators were put in charge of it. People, rather than working in large communal farms, the farms were cut into sections so individuals had their individual plots and worked on them. And then there were people who supplied to the farms and took from the farms, and they were higher in the party. And it was very much a form of system where the members of what called itself the Communist Party became what had previously been the capitalist and ruling classes. That's why it was portrayed as such in Animal Farm, because it wasn't a movement towards communism. It was in fact state capitalism, which was very much Stalinism. It was because Trotsky made such vociferous complaints that Russia was staying at state capitalism and not moving towards socialism or communism, that he needed to be disposed of as an enemy of the revolution. The next one from that is state socialism. Now this is moving towards the centre ground of politics. The actual centre ground, not what's considered the centre ground in modern day times. Also in this centre ground will be Keynesianism or liberalism. To start with liberalism. In 1795, there was something called Speen-Hamland passed in England. It was an idea at the time when the Napoleonic War was on and there was difficulty with production of some goods, and there was the beginnings of the introduction of mechanisation in farms, and people were being laid off as farm labourers who'd worked for generations in those farms. Those individual villages where people were settled under the Settlement Act from 1558 would then be required to provide sustenance to ensure that these people continued to live and didn't simply die or cause revolt at a time when most of the army was away fighting Napoleon. It was a situation that created a lot of the arguments you get today for welfare. They're all just lying around scroungers. These people had been farm labourers who'd worked hard on the farm up to the point where it was decided that a threshing machine could do what they did by hand a lot quicker, and you would only need one person to run it. What happened then was that there was a sort of backlash. At the same time these people were considered lazy, a lot of children were employed by factory owners because they were cheaper and easier to control. And a lot of children died in factories, while a lot of their parents were left jobless. And it was a dire situation, it was a terrible situation. These children, however, as they grew older, the ones who survived, the very few who survived, and had seen the horrors, decided that no future generation of children should suffer it again. And you got a tremendous resurgence, a tremendous movement of political movements amongst the lowest class of society. This led to things like Calvinism and Chartism, and the suffrage movement become popular. It led to arguments against the established political parties, which at the time were the Tories, which represented the landowners, and the Whigs, which represented the business interests in town. A movement that the political party was needed, which represented the people who were neither landowners nor business owners. This movement in around 1840 was liberalism, the formation of a liberal party. It was intended to be free of tyranny and control. The actual leading philosopher to do with liberalism is a German called Humboldt. His ideas at the time were much an argument against the state, but they weren't an argument against the state because the state at the time, remember, were pretty much the interests of the landowners and the business owners. They were in fact an argument against the moneyed control of the citizens and the repression of the freedom to live their lives of the citizens. The argument at the time was that people should have 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours to develop and live as human beings. And I think that sometimes classical liberalism is misinterpreted as just being against the state, when in fact what it was against repressive work regimes that were turning people into, were described as robots, robotniks, people who simply worked and operated to do nothing but work until they die. State socialism, separate from actual socialism, doesn't include the ownership of all small factories by the workers. It includes the ownership by the state, the central democratically elected state, of those things which are natural monopolies, things like the water supply in modern day times, the electric and gas supply in modern day times, the oil that was underneath that land would all be there to be owned by the state, and the profits of which would help the state support the people of the state. A democratically voted upon state where if people didn't like what was happening, they could change their government. Keynesianism in itself, from John Maynard Keynes, included elements of this state socialism and elements of the state being the employee of last resort when people weren't working. He argued that rather than having people unemployed and all the social costs and social problems from that, it was better to have people simply employed by the state in any function. Of course, it would be better if the function was something like creating the infrastructure or or creating goods, etc. And if you had state-owned factories and state-owned companies, state-owned electricity and gas, etc., the people could be employed in that. Those people would then have the money, and the people at the bottom having the money created the market because they needed good or wanted goods and services. So it was a sort of balanced idea, because there was full employment under the idea, or relatively full employment. It actually gave a lot of power to things like trade unions. And at a time when trade unions could successfully argue and negotiate with their bosses, that wasn't a situation of imbalance, it was a situation of balance between the people and their bosses. And it worked very well in the 1950s and 60s when it created the wealth that we are still taking today in England, in Britain, and in the US. It created the middle class. It was, in some ways, at the time when it was first instigated, called the Conservative Revolution, because many people at the time were very interested in ideas of socialism and communism. And it was thought to ameliorate the harm and be a centre ground, a central position where people would be happy that the state was now working to help them without wanting to remove the ownership of the large companies and the factories from the rich families which owned them. Next position over, is also quite a central position, though it's not considered to be in modern day parlance, and that's conservatism. Conservatism simply means conserving the social structure that there is, and it is the edge of the right wing. It doesn't do anything particularly harmful, and if you have a fair society, conservatism in and of itself should hold that society in place. It's also a support for feudalism. Now, there's much misnomers, and many of which arose at the time when the earliest times of capitalism came along, and there was lots of stories told about how previous feudalist societies had been worse. Feudalism, or feudal societies, were heavily regulated and heavily regimented. There was controls even over what people wore, so that there were sorts of forms of uniform worn by people of different classes, and it was immediately evident who was of which class, and you kept your place. You were expected to serve your local manor, and he was expected to serve his local lord, and the lord was expected to serve the king, and you were expected to be available for military service from the age of 10. But in return, the king was expected to make sure that the lords did their function, that the manor house people did their function in ensuring that the population stayed home, housed, well fed, well looked after, fit and healthy and ready to serve their king when necessary. There were systems in place such as a form of free inheritance of small buildings by families. They would simply be entered in the local register that a family lived in that location, and then when the parents died, in what were admittedly small huts that were owned by the local manor house or the local lord, the children would simply take over that living accommodation, and it was simply recorded that they lived there to prevent any type of fraud. It's a system that was very stable and perhaps only fell to bits when the Black Death arose and half the population died. And in some places, the whole population of the village died, and people moved in and simply took over the village who didn't have those same feudal responsibilities. Society structure broke down, and capitalism took over. The next position is republicanism, or regulated capitalism. The reason that I've put this to the right of feudalism is that it has less responsibility to the people. It's also a movement away from the state slightly, and movement away from the state in either direction tends to take you away from the centre ground. Regulated capitalism meant that well, firstly I'll describe what capitalism is. Capitalism isn't you deciding to start your own small business. It isn't you working for a living. It isn't a market where goods are bought and sold. Capitalism is a situation where the rich have the money. Other people who are poor but who are enterprising and want to start companies need to go to those rich people to get that money to start their companies or to run their companies. The rich then intend to have a large profit return from the money they've invested in those companies. It's not people working for a living, it's rich people getting more out than they put in. And it can be a very bad situation if the rich people decide to take everything, which is why it is best when it is regulated. Regulated capitalism is probably closer than Keynesianism in terms of how things were in the 50s and 60s in America. There was very much a balance of the both. There was state funding for privately owned companies rather than having those companies become state owned. Regulated capitalism works quite well for a society as well, if properly regulated. The next position over is state corporatism, or fascism. When capitalism is less well regulated or corporations exist, there tends to be more of a move to monopolize, and those corporations with an increased power and then increased size and then increased profit have increasing influence over the government. State corporatism is where the corporations and their private interests are held paramount, and it's backed up by the strength of the state. Of course, Hitler ran this system. He called himself socialist because after the problem they'd had in feudal Germany in the First World War, there was a great deal of popularity within the communist and socialist movement in Germany in the 1920s, which couldn't be repressed despite the Treaty of Versailles acting to try and crush that spirit within the German people. The Germans did feel the stress, however, of giving so much money in US dollars to the Americans and the French each and every year. And when Hitler came along, he realized that promising a system similar to feudalism, similar to a right-wing system, wouldn't be popular among the people. So he simply called his system socialism, while he operated what was in fact a polar opposite of socialism. Hitler's Germany was so corporate in structure that even individual parts of the army were corporations that wanted to make profit for the rich owners of the corporation, for the rich shareholders. And when the SS invented camouflage uniforms, they couldn't be used by other parts of the army unless they were willing to pay royalties for the patent to the SS. It's not a system that works well for the state. It works simply to ensure the corporations continue to profit, but it does at least have some small state element which may or may not ameliorate the harm. To the right of this is a different form of libertarianism. Not called anywhere else in the world libertarianism. American libertarianism, or libertarian capitalism, is a system where there is a removement of the regulation, an entire removal of regulation by the state. This really tends towards monopolies. It tends towards total control by rich people. If you remove the state completely, you don't have a system where you have simple freedom for everybody. You have a system where you have what Rousseau in his book The Social Contract described as the tyranny of freedom. People no longer have the protection of the state. And it's a system that is very attractive to rich people who've took over the Tea Party movement in America and who want to use the Tea Party movement to remove all state regulation. Libertarian capitalism also tends towards ideas where people start to be able to employ their own private armies because there's no regulatory control of that, and their own private army will simply do what they want to the population without any democratic accountability. It also dislikes democracy. State corporatism or fascism still contained the facade of democracy. Libertarian capitalism argues that democracy isn't necessary. You just need the rich people who own the businesses to control things. And the only thing to the right of that is absolutism, where there is one person in absolute monarchic control. Now, it could be said at the time of feudalism, sometimes it slipped towards absolutism, but on those occasions, you'd find that the person who'd set themselves up as absolute ruler had a high probability that they were going to die young or suddenly.